312. Exit the roundabout onto the parkway. Continue on the parkway for 1 mile. In a quarter of a mile, at Cranford Parkway interchange, take the second exit onto the M4 slip road to Heathrow Airport, M25. Exit the roundabout onto the slip road. In a quarter of a mile, merge onto M4.
In the world, and it helped accelerate the gradual granting of independence to the British Empire.
Once the daughter of an emperor, by the end of her reign, the Queen was just trying to keep together her commonwealth of nations as we reckon with an ever more problematic past.
Britain's role in the empire had become much more controversial, widely criticised as being white privilege and exploitative.
Time has come to fully leave our colonial past behind. Barbadians want a Barbadian head of state.
With the 70s came a monumental moment, inclusion into the European common market.
The EU was doing well, Britain was not doing well, so pressure for Britain to enter the EU grew and grew as Britain joined on the 1st of January 1973.
Of course, our exit, then decades later, turned out to be just as monumental.
Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
In the 80s, Britain went to war.
Jammed.
a time, Britain under Margaret Thatcher became again a more significant power in the world, but only, this is the key point, in alliance with the United States.
Throughout this period, of course, from the 60s to the 90s, terror reigned with the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
A grenade was thrown, and then there was a massive explosion.
Fleet band of West Belfast, complete with paramilitary spectacles.
The death toll in Northern Ireland in 1972 reached 467.
Here, the Queen famously put country before self when in 2012 she shook the hand of Martin McGuinness, former commander of the IRA, the organisation that murdered her cousin, Lord Mountbatten.
A very historic sight, believe you me. The Queen shaking hands with Martin McGuinness.
Nationalism too has waxed and waned in all four nations throughout this era.
Shall be a Team Scotland to take this nation forward.
Scotland became steadily like a loose tooth, wobbling more and more in the jaw of the United Kingdom. Even Northern Ireland again became more uncertain.
But there's no doubt that the most seismic...
In half a mile, keep right to stay on M4.
...very end.
To stay at home, protect our NHS, and save lives.
One thing's for certain, for that new 27-year-old Queen, Great Britain today would have been almost unrecognisable.
No reign in British history since William I came to the throne
Keep right to stay on M4.
has much transformation. The reason for that is partly that she was the longest serving monarch, but also that the
Continue on M4 for 2 miles.
rapid.
Historian Sir Anthony Selden concluding Rachel Venable's report. Of course, reflecting on the Queen, but we need to look forward chronologically, not emotionally, to the arrival of the new King. My LBC colleague Martin Stanton was taking you through a little bit of the process of that. But what is happening at was King Charles' former residence, Highgrove. Let's go to LBC's reporter Tom Seymour, who's outside Highgrove in Gloucestershire. Tom?
Highgrove House and Gardens has been the home of King Charles III since 1980. It's in rural Gloucestershire near the town of Tetbury, and Gloucestershire being a county strongly associated with the royal family, with Princess Anne and her 2 children, the eldest grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth, also living here in Gloucestershire at Gatcombe Park. Now, it's not yet known when King Charles will return here, but a large part of Highgrove is open to the public, so people wishing to pass on their sympathies are likely to be arriving here throughout today, over the weekend and into the next week. It's not yet clear whether King Charles will move into Buckingham Palace, with conflicting reports about this, but that has been the official residence of the monarch since Queen Victoria moved there in 1837, and along with Buckingham Palace he's also inherited Sandringham, Windsor Castle and Balmoral. King Charles III is expected to travel to London today after spending the night in Balmoral last night, and will meet with the new Prime Minister Liz Truss before addressing the nation later on this evening. When the Queen died, the throne passed immediately to Charles, who will be known as King Charles III. He could have chosen any of his 4 names, Charles, Philip, Arthur and George, but he's settled for King Charles III, and at 73 he's the oldest person in history to assume the British throne. He's expected to be proclaimed king at St James's Palace in London at some point tomorrow, and then when he is declared as king after that, for the first time since 1952, when the national anthem is played, we will be singing God Save the King.
In a quarter of a mile, keep right to stay on M4.
Being passed on King Charles III's home in rural Gloucestershire, where he will be returning at some point in the coming week.
Tom Seymour reporting from outside Highgrove. Coming up after the news, we've already been...
Keep right to stay on M4.
The United Kingdom, we're in Cardiff and we're in Belfast. And indeed later in the show, the United Kingdom, with the passing of this monarch. How...
Continue on M4 for 4 miles.
The Union. I think it's fair to say that the respective leaders of Wales and Scotland had enormous respect for the monarch, and I'm sure they will be respectful to King Charles. But does this really threaten the unity of the United Kingdom? We'll be looking at that later in the show. 6:45 to the LBC Newsroom, headline Simon Conway.
The nation is beginning a period of mourning following the death of Britain's longest-serving monarch, Her Majesty the Queen, at the age of 96. The new King, Charles III, will return to London from Balmoral later with Camilla, the Queen Consort, and is expected to address the nation this evening. MPs will gather in the Commons from midday to pay tribute to the Queen. LBC weather, a mixture of sunny spells and showers, some heavy with hail and thunder, a high of 21 degrees.
Well, I mentioned we'd go around the rest of the country. Let's start with Cardiff. LBC's reporter Daniel Bevan joins me now. Daniel.
Well, Nick, in front of me, 4 flags, amongst them the Union Jack and the Welsh flag, are flying proudly at half-mast. And also, the floral tributes have more than doubled overnight, being laid by members of the public. This is where Her Majesty visited on her final ever trip to Wales. It was in October of last year for the opening of the 6th Senedd term. She met with COVID community champions, very fitting given her now iconic "We will meet again" message during the pandemic. These people in Cardiff Bay gave us their reaction to Her Majesty's passing.
She's been such an inspirational leader for so many people over the years, and I think a real figurehead for the country.
I feel really sad for the family, you know, just Mum and Nana, wouldn't it? And
gone through a lot of troubles in the recent years, but she's pulled it through, and what have you. She's been a good monarch over the years.
I don't know, she just sort of represents all that is British, isn't it? This sort of sense of fair play, restraint.
Yeah, it just feels like a bit of an end of an era.
Her Majesty was in good spirits on that visit last year. The electronic advertising boards here in Cardiff Bay now have a black and white photo of the Queen taken from that day. One of the people to greet her when she arrived was the First Minister of Wales, Mark.
In 2 miles, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
As our longest reigning monarch, Her Majesty firmly upheld the values and traditions of the British monarchy. On behalf of the Welsh Government and people in all parts of Wales, I offer our deepest condolences to all Her Majesty's children and their families on this sad occasion.
Her Majesty's personal connections with Wales are perhaps a bit more subtle than other UK nations, but nevertheless are significant. Her wedding band, for example, was made of Welsh gold, which she later remarked meant she always kept a piece of this country with her wherever she went. We'll now hear from LBC's Northern Ireland correspondent Amanda Ferguson in Belfast.
Flowers have been laid at locations in Belfast and at Hillsborough Castle, the royal family's official residence, and tributes have been paid to the Queen from across the political spectrum in Northern Ireland and on both sides of the border in Ireland. Stormont's First Minister designate Michelle O'Neill said the British people will miss the leadership she gave as a monarch, and the Sinn Féin president also spoke of the Queen's warmth and courtesy and said she was grateful to her significant contribution and determined efforts to advancing peace and reconciliation. DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson MP said that Her Majesty the Queen had been a steadfast and unshakable head of state for the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Unionist Party leader Doug Beattie said the passing of Queen Elizabeth II is one of the saddest days the United Kingdom has ever known. Belfast Lord Lieutenant, the PSNI Chief Constable, the Older People Commissioner and the Orange Order are among those reflecting warmly on the Queen's contribution to life. And the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins,
In a quarter of a mile, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
The Irish tricolour was flying at half-mast from government buildings in Dublin. Back to you in the studio, Nick.
There's some reporting before her you heard from Daniel Bevan in Cardiff. Well, that's going around the United Kingdom. In the next hour, we're
exit at junction 6.
Well, that's on the newspaper side. But of course, on the broadcast side, it's already been at the top of the agenda.
This is CNN Breaking News.
In a quarter of a mile, at the roundabout, take the 3rd exit onto Tons Lane, A355.
Palace. Max, what are you learning?
The Queen has died, very sadly. She died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon.
Well, we're going to do it the reverse. We're going to go now to the US and hear how the news is playing out there. Sean Mandel is a royal commentator. He's in Los Angeles. He hosts the Spilling Royal Tea podcast. Sean, give us an idea of how the US media is portraying this. Is it lead story? Good morning.
Good morning, and it is in fact the lead story. In fact, if you go to the top of the New York Times website, it is still at the top of that website, still at the top of most websites, down to entertainment news outlets and pop culture news outlets as well. So it's really the top story, not just in a particular corner of the media in the US. It really has touched and been at the top of the media coverage really across all different genres, all different areas of coverage.
So here's the thing. My phone rang last night from someone when I lived and worked in the US. I worked with her 30 years ago, and she rang just to say, hope everything's okay with you. It's extraordinary.
Exit the roundabout onto Tons Lane.
Folk in the US have for Elizabeth, is it not, Sean?
It is, and I will tell you...
In a quarter of a mile, turn left towards Sippenham Lane.
My friends all know that this is something that I follow quite closely, and of course I did not, know Her Majesty personally, and yet the outpouring of messages I've received just to me about the Queen's death, and people sharing their own anecdotes, their own remembrances of her. And these are people who've never met her. These are people who, have never been her subjects. People who who are certainly not like me.
Turn left towards Sippenham Lane.
They followed her life and her work closely, but you can't help but exist and be touched by her legacy, by her work. Not only
continue for 1.5 miles.
7 decades on the throne, but because of her significance as in the U.S. Pop culture landscape. It may sound, somewhat profane to call it that, but with the lack of her having obviously not an official role in the U.S. as the U.S. is not a Commonwealth nation or anything. She and the monarchy took on and will continue to take on a role that exists more in the imagination, I think, of a lot of Americans.
So lastly, let me ask you this, Sean. The key question, the $64,000 question, as you might say, is the level of respect, and I'm going to say love, afforded to Queen Elizabeth II from the US. Do you see that now shifting in whole to Charles III?
In whole, no, I don't. If I'm just reading the tea leaves and paying attention to what conversations I've had with people and seeing also social media commentary.
And why might that be, Sean? Why might that be?
There's a number of reasons, and I think there are a lot of people who are there's going to be a large contingent of people who will have, well wishes for Charles. But I will say that as much as the Queen was admired in the United States, I think the only person from the royal family that rivals that is still the late Princess of Wales, Diana. And I do believe that there are still people in the United States who are devoted to her memory, who look at Charles still as King Charles, we should say now, as the man that cheated on her.
They see Diana, of course, as the wronged party, as it were, Sean. And I was wondering if that sentiment was abroad. Sean Mandel, thank you. You're a royal commentator joining us from Los Angeles. You host the Spilling Royal Tea podcast. Let's come right back here to the United Kingdom and bring into the conversation Charles Anson, who served as press secretary to Queen Elizabeth for 7 years. Wow, that's a tough gig, if I may call it that, Mr. Anson. What did you learn about the Queen's dedication to service in those 7 years? Good morning.
Good morning to you. And I served as press secretary between 1990 and 97, so during the period of Anna Cerebral, some of the most difficult years of the Queen's reign. And I was always struck by how much she kept her equilibrium, however difficult things got, whether it's on the general political front or in her own family terms. The Queen remained steady as a rock, and I think that's what a lot of people feel about this outstandingly distinguished and long reign, that the Queen has stayed steady and stayed calm in the most difficult of circumstances, and has given that sort of reassurance as head of state in a society that's been changing so much, and she's the sort of still small voice of calm there at the centre, and always has been and remains so even in her last few years.
Where did she get that level of stoicism and support from, Charles? How important was the late Duke of Edinburgh?
Well, I think the support of a very strong and committed husband, fascinated and interested in public service.
In a quarter of a mile, turn left onto Deal Avenue.
So I think some of that's come from her marriage, but a lot has come from her own temperament. The Queen has a quiet, steady, unflustered temperament, and of course in that role as a non-political head of state, that's a very useful quality to have, and that calmness, I think.
Take the next left onto Deal Avenue, then your destination will be on the right.
And combined with the faith that she has, that's been a sort of